He hates kids, hates dogs, hates trees. I bet he even hates the blue sky. I nearly choked on my coffee when I heard that. I was sitting on my porch, minding my own business, when the little voice rang out from across the fence. Peering over my newspaper, I spotted her, a tiny blonde girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed grin, staring at my house like it held some dark secret. "Lily, that's not nice," her mother scolded gently. "But Mom, look at his house. The grass is all dry, the windows are always closed, and he never comes outside. It looks like a haunted house." I grumbled under my breath and turned back to my newspaper. Kids. It had been years since I'd had to deal with one up close. My wife, Margaret, had always been the friendly one, the type to bake cookies for the neighbors, to stop and chat at the grocery store, to laugh at the sound of kids playing outside. When she passed, I shut the door to the world and never opened it again. For 20 years, I lived in this house alone, content in my solitude. The neighbors learned to leave me be. They waved at a distance, but no one bothered knocking. That was just how I liked it, until she showed up. The next morning, just as I was settling into my chair with a fresh cup of coffee, I heard it again. "Good morning, Mr. Walter." I nearly spilled my drink. There she was, standing at the edge of my yard, beaming like we were old friends. I stared at her. I didn't wave. I didn't nod. I just stared. She didn't move. Finally, I grumbled, "Morning." That should have been the end of it. But the next day, she did it again. And again. Rain or shine, she greeted me every single morning, her little voice ringing out like a church bell. If I ignored her, she just waved harder. If I scowled, she giggled. If I muttered something under my breath, she would tilt her head and say, "What was that, Mr. Walter? I couldn't hear you." And then the real trouble started. One morning, I opened my front door and found a plate of cookies sitting on my porch. Chocolate chip. My favorite. There was a note next to them, written in bright pink crayon. "For Mr. Walter, because smiling is easier with cookies." I looked around, half expecting to see her peeking from behind a bush. Sure enough, there she was, sitting cross-legged on her porch, watching me with hopeful eyes. I picked up the plate, sniffed the cookies, then, without a word, shut the door behind me. I didn't eat them. I wasn't about to be tricked into some neighborly nonsense. But I didn't throw them away either. That was mistake number one. The cookies were only the beginning. Lily, it turned out, was on a mission. Every morning, she tried something new. One day, she left a dandelion bouquet on my porch. The next, a small, lumpy rock she had painted bright blue. The day after that, a handwritten note that said, "I hope you have a good day." I never responded, never thanked her, but I also never threw anything away. That was mistake number two. One morning, as I watered my lawn, more out of habit than any real care for it, I heard her voice behind me. "Mr. Walter, I think you need a hug." I nearly dropped the hose. "I don't need a hug," I said, adjusting my cap. "But hugs make everything better." "No, they don't." "Yes, they do." "No, they..." Before I could finish, she had already wrapped her tiny arms around my waist. I froze. I hadn't been hugged in years. Margaret used to hug me every morning, even when I was grumpy. Especially when I was grumpy. I swallowed hard. "You're flooding my yard, kid." She looked down. Sure enough, the water was pooling around our feet. "Oops." She giggled, letting go. I turned off the hose and stomped inside, pretending not to hear her laughter trailing behind me. That night, I sat at my desk, staring at all the little gifts she had left. The rocks. The notes. The dandelions now wilted. Why was she doing this? Why was she so determined to befriend me? Hadn't anyone told her that some people like being alone? The next morning, I expected another cookie plate, or maybe a flower. Instead, I found something that made me stop in my tracks. It was a drawing. A simple crayon sketch of two stick figures, one small with pigtails and one old and grumpy-looking, sitting side by side on a bench. At the top, in wobbly letters, she had written, "For Mr. Walter, my maybe friend." I stared at it. Something in my chest tightened, like an old door creaking open after years of rust. And instead of throwing it away like I should have, I carefully tucked it into my desk drawer. That was mistake number 3. And by then, I was in real trouble. I told myself it meant nothing. The drawing, the cookies, the ridiculous dandelion bouquets. They were just things. Trivial little gestures from an overly friendly kid. But the truth, the annoying truth, was that every morning, I found myself waiting for the next one. And every morning, like clockwork, another drawing appeared on my porch. One day it was a cat. A truly horrible cat, with giant eyes and a tail that defied all logic. Beneath it, she had written, "This is Whiskers. He's not real, but I wish he was. Do you like cats, Mr. Walter?" I snorted. I hated cats. Always knocking things over, climbing where they shouldn't. But instead of ignoring it, I did something I hadn't done in years. I picked up a pen, scrawled 3 words at the bottom, and slid the drawing under her door. Cats are trouble. The next day, another drawing. This time, a dog with floppy ears. Okay, but what about dogs? I hesitated, then wrote back, "They bark too much." The following day, a bird. What about birds? They poop everywhere. A fish? Too quiet. A bunny? Too fluffy. A turtle? Too slow. Every morning, a new drawing. Every afternoon, my reluctant response. And somehow, without meaning to, without wanting to, this ridiculous exchange became the most consistent thing in my life. Lily was dragging me, kicking and grumbling, out of my self-imposed isolation, one terrible drawing at a time. Then one morning, the drawing stopped. I checked my porch. Nothing. I checked my mailbox. Empty. I told myself I didn't care. But the longer the silence stretched, the more I found myself pacing the living room, peeking through the blinds like some paranoid old fool. Where was she? Why had she stopped writing? And why did my house suddenly feel too quiet? By the 3rd day, I had enough. I walked to her house and knocked. Hard. Her mother answered, looking tired. "Mr. Hughes?" she asked, surprised. I cleared my throat, shifting uncomfortably. "I haven't seen Lily." Her face softened. "Oh, she's been sick. A bad case of the flu. She's been in bed all week." Something twisted in my chest. Sick? Lily was sick, and I hadn't even noticed? I nodded stiffly. Tell her to get well soon." Then I turned and walked away before her mother could see the ridiculous lump forming in my throat. That night, I sat at my desk, staring at a blank sheet of paper. For decades, I had been a writer, a published author, a storyteller. But when Margaret died, the words died too. I had convinced myself I would never write again. Until now. I picked up my pen and, for the first time in 20 years, I wrote a story. I wrote about a grumpy old man who didn't believe in friends. I wrote about a little girl who changed his mind. I wrote about terrible cat drawings, stubborn letters, and a bond that formed in the quiet spaces between laughter and loneliness. Then carefully, I folded the paper, walked to Lily's house, and slipped it under her door. It was the first real letter I had written in years, and I had no idea if she would ever write back. The next morning, I heard a knock on my door. When I opened it, there she was. Lily. Pale, sniffling, wrapped in a blanket, but grinning. She held up a new drawing. This time, it wasn't a cat, or a dog, or a bird. It was us. 2 stick figures, one small with pigtails, one old and grumpy looking, sitting side by side on a bench. And beneath it, in wobbly letters, she had written, "For Mr. Walter." My real friend. Something warm settled in my chest. Something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. I cleared my throat. "Feeling better, kid?" She nodded. "Yep." "And guess what?" "What?" "I liked your story." I raised an eyebrow. Yeah. She grinned. "But I think you forgot something." She held up her drawing again and pointed at the empty space beside us. "You forgot to add Whiskers." And before I could stop myself, I laughed. Not a chuckle. Not a scoff. A real, honest-to-goodness laugh. The kind I thought I had forgotten how to do. Lily's grin widened. "See? I knew you could smile." I shook my head, still chuckling. "You're a menace, kid." She shrugged. "Maybe. But now you're stuck with me. And you know what? For the first time in 20 years, I didn't mind one bit.